900 acres of Cotswold clay, a gate with a hand-painted sign, a man in a Barbour who can't tell wheat from barley. That's diddly squat. But farms don't have villains. Farms don't build to a cliffhanger. So why did this one feel like it was racing toward one every single week? Diddly squat was never a farm. It was a set, dressed in mud, built for a camera, and the council spent 4 years playing a villain they never auditioned for. By the end of this, that gate won't look like a farm entrance anymore. It'll look like a curtain going up. Start with the sign, that hand-painted, slightly crooked, diddly squat farm board at the entrance. The one every visitor photographs before they've even parked, before they've even switched off the engine. Camera phones out through the windscreen, like they're arriving somewhere consecrated. A real working farm doesn't need a sign like that. A real working farm has a name that appears on invoices and subsidy paperwork, and absolutely nowhere else. Nobody photographs the entrance to a dairy unit in Shropshire. Nobody parks up on a verge in Lincolnshire to get a picture of a grain store. Farm gates, traditionally, are functional objects. 5-bar, galvanised, held shut with a loop of orange twine, entirely unphotographed for the whole of their working lives. But Clarkson understood something the agricultural establishment took years to properly catch up with, that the sign wasn't marking a boundary at all. It was raising a curtain. Everyone who drove up that gravel track wasn't visiting a farm. They were walking onto a set, whether they realised it or not, and some deep instinctive part of them clearly did realise it, because they behaved accordingly. They took photographs, they lingered, they treated the gate the way you'd treat the entrance to somewhere you'd only previously seen through a screen. And sets have a peculiar quality that working farms simply don't. They ask to be looked at. Every gate, every battered Lamborghini tractor sitting incongruously against a field of rape, every hand-lettered price board propped up in the shop with the ink slightly running from the damp. All of it composed, whether consciously or not, for an audience that was always, somehow, going to be there. Compare that to the way land actually works when nobody's watching. Real farming is repetitive by design, and there's a dignity in that repetition that television rarely bothers to capture. The same rotation, year on year, the same anxious glances at the sky before harvest, the same silence broken only by the diesel thrum of machinery and the particular quiet of a field at dusk. It doesn't perform, it endures. That's rather the point of it. Continuity, not spectacle, the slow accumulation of seasons rather than the sharp arc of an episode. Diddly Squat inverted that entirely, and did so with a confidence that, in hindsight, looks almost calculated. Every failure became footage before it became a lesson learned. Every mistake was capital before it was ever corrected. A farmer who genuinely wanted his crop to succeed would never plant it 2 weeks late for the sake of a dramatic race against the frost. He'd plant it on time, like every sensible farmer before him, and sleep rather better for it. But a storyteller might delay it, and increasingly that's what Clarkson was becoming. Episode by episode. A storyteller who happened to own a combine harvester, rather than a farmer who happened to be filmed. The land was real. The mud, unquestionably, was real. Anyone who's watched him sink a Lamborghini, tractor axle deep in a field knows that much. But the frame around it, the thing that turned soil into narrative, weather into tension, a broken plough into a plot point, was never agricultural. It was theatrical, dressed in Wellingtons. And once you see that, you genuinely can't unsee it in a single frame of the show. Now to the shed, the shop, the now legendary structure that began, quite literally, as 4 walls and some potatoes with a hand-painted sign propped against a hay bale, the whole operation looking as though it might blow away in a stiff wind. A proper farm shop, the kind that's dotted the English countryside for the better part of a century, exists to solve a fairly mundane logistical problem: too much veg, not enough market, and a farmer's wife with a spare Tuesday afternoon and a biscuit tin doing the accounts by hand. It's practical. It's quiet. Nobody queues for it, because there's nothing to queue for beyond a decent marrow and perhaps some free-range eggs. Diddly Squat's shop solved no such problem. It created one, almost overnight. Within weeks of the first series airing, the narrow lanes around Chadlington were gridlocked, with cars queuing for a jar of chili jam that most of those buyers could have found. At half the price and none of the wait, 20 minutes down the road in a supermarket with an actual car park. That's not commerce in any conventional sense. That's pilgrimage, dressed up as a shopping trip. People weren't buying honey. They were buying proximity, the chance to stand, however briefly, inside a story they'd already fallen for on their sofa the night before, jar in hand as a sort of souvenir of having been there. And this is where the 16-mile sourcing rule comes in. The planning condition the council imposed almost as a punishment, restricting the shop to selling only what could be grown or made within 16 miles of the farm. It was meant to hem him in, to make the operation smaller and more manageable and considerably less profitable. Instead, it became the very thing that made the shop feel like something other than retail. Every product on that shelf had a provenance you could point to on a map. Every jar had a farmer's name attached to it, a face you half recognised from an earlier episode, a supplier who'd suddenly found himself part of the story too, whether he'd asked for that or not. A conventional shop sells goods. Diddly squat sold context, packaged in glass jars and cardboard boxes. And context, it turns out, is the one thing supermarkets have never quite worked out how to stock, no matter how many locally sourced labels they print. That's the second reason it never felt like a farm. Farms grow things to sell at the best price the market allows, and that's the whole of it. Diddly Squat grew a story and sold entry to it, one overpriced jar of chutney at a time, to a queue that kept coming back for more. Every good drama needs its supporting cast, and this is where Diddly Squat quietly stopped resembling agriculture altogether and started resembling something rather closer to a soap opera with Wellingtons and a Yorkshire accent. Caleb Cooper wasn't hired for charisma, and it's worth remembering that. He was the farm manager already working the land when Clarkson bought it, a young man with an unshakable confidence in his own opinions, a working knowledge of the land that made him the obvious authority in every scene, and absolutely no patience whatsoever for celebrity, which turned out to be exactly the right chemistry for the whole thing to work. Gerald, the Drystone Waller whose accent occasionally required subtitles for viewers south of Birmingham, wasn't cast for comic timing either. He'd been building walls in that particular corner of Oxfordshire since long before anyone thought to point a camera at him, stone by stone, in a trade that hasn't changed its methods in 2 centuries. Real farms have workers. They don't have characters. Nobody on an actual working farm gets a story arc, a signature catchphrase repeated back at them in supermarket car parks, or a devoted online fanbase tracking their every appearance across 3 continents. But Diddly Squat's cast accumulated exactly that, not because anyone scripted it, and you can tell they didn't, but because the camera simply refused to look away from people who were entirely, stubbornly, unimprovably themselves. And that's precisely why it worked, when so many imitators since have missed the point entirely. The moment any of it had felt manufactured, a farm manager coached to be quirkier, a Waller polished to be more quotable, a rehearsed line delivered a beat too smoothly, the whole thing would have collapsed under its own artifice. Audiences, whatever else you say about them, can generally smell a performance a mile off, and they'll forgive almost anything except being condescended to. What kept them watching, week after week, was the opposite of performance. People who plainly couldn't care less that a camera was there, going about work that would have happened exactly the same way with or without it. A farm doesn't need its workers to be interesting. It needs them to be competent, reliable, and roughly on time for milking. Diddly Squat needed both, and got remarkably lucky, or perhaps wasn't lucky at all, in finding people who were already, unmistakably, both things at once, without a single audition between them. Now, no story of this scale survives without an antagonist, and Diddly Squat found its without even having to look terribly hard. West Oxfordshire District Council became, entirely inadvertently, the most reliable recurring character in the entire show, more consistent in fact than some of the human cast. Every planning refusal, every enforcement notice, delivered with the crisp officiousness of local government doing precisely what local government is designed to do. Every rejected extension for a car park, a restaurant, a marquee. On paper, these were bureaucratic inconveniences, the sort of grinding administrative weight that sinks most small rural businesses quietly, without anyone outside the parish ever hearing about it. On screen, they became something else entirely. Obstacles in a hero's path, rendered with all the dramatic tension of a heist film, where the vault keeps changing its combination at the worst possible moment. A working farm treats the council as an unfortunate, unglamorous cost of doing business, something to be endured in silence, over a cup of tea and a strongly worded letter. Diddly Squat treated it as plot, and did so almost gleefully. Every objection raised against the farm shop, every refused application pinned to a notice board and read aloud to camera, became another episode's worth of tension, broadcast to millions of people across dozens of countries who'd never once given a thought to rural planning law before switching on. And here's the delicious irony that the council never quite reckoned with, and perhaps still hasn't. Every single refusal made the farm more famous, not less. The very body trying to restrain the enterprise was, without realising it, co-writing its most compelling storylines, week after week, entirely for free. They believed, presumably, that they held the leverage. The planning department, the zoning maps, the area of outstanding natural beauty designation. In practice, they were simply supplying the conflict that a good story always needs, and doing so with the reliability of a script editor who never missed a deadline. That's not agriculture. That's drama, complete with a villain who kept turning up for encore performances it never once intended to give, and an audience that grew to rather enjoy hating them for it. By the time the barley became Hawkston lager, the pretense had rather worn thin, not because anyone was hiding anything deliberately, but because the beer made the whole structure impossible to ignore any longer, however you squinted at it. A farm sells what it grows, and that's usually the end of the transaction. It doesn't typically need a brewery, a distribution deal with 3 major supermarket chains, or a 134% year-on-year growth rate to justify the barley sitting in the ground. But that's precisely what Hawkston delivered, at a pace that startled people who'd been in the drinks trade for decades. Sales climbing past £20 million, stocked in supermarkets and well over 2,000 pubs nationwide, an entire second business built on the back of what had started as nothing more than a crop rotation decision. And notice what didn't happen here, because it's rather the point. Clarkson didn't license his name to an existing drinks company and collect a check from the sidelines, the way most celebrity-branded booze operates. A familiar face on a label, someone else doing the actual brewing somewhere far away. He built an actual brewery, with actual brewers, sourcing actual barley from actual farms within a few miles of his own land. When Carlsberg reportedly came calling with a substantial acquisition offer, he turned it down within 24 hours, because the moment you separate the beer from the story of where it came from, you're left with just another lager on a crowded shelf, indistinguishable from a dozen others. This is the moment Diddley Squat stopped pretending to be a farm and finally revealed what it had been quietly building towards all along. Not a single enterprise, but an entire interlocking ecosystem, each part feeding the next like gears in a very well-oiled, very English machine. The farm grew the barley, the brewery made the beer. The television show advertised both, at no cost whatsoever, to millions of people who'd chosen, of their own free will, to watch. The shop sold the results to a queue that stretched, quite literally, down a country lane never designed to hold that much traffic. That's not a farm's economics. That's something closer to a small, self-sustaining industry that simply happens to have a tractor parked somewhere in the middle of it. Now, if this is the sort of story you enjoy, the kind that peels back what's really happening behind the footage, and finds something rather more interesting underneath, do hit subscribe and tap that notification bell. There's plenty more of this to come, and I'd genuinely hate for you to miss it. And if you've got a diddly squat visit of your own tucked away, or a strong opinion about the price of that honey, do drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. And then, almost inevitably, came the pub. The farmer's dog didn't arrive as a retirement project or a passing whim of a passion purchase. It arrived as the final piece of an architecture that had been under quiet construction since that first shed full of potatoes and a hand-painted sign. A pub with a menu that changes with the British seasons rather than a head office spreadsheet, sourcing meat and vegetables from farms within a defined and carefully considered radius, serving a beer brewed from barley, grown a few fields away, poured by staff who could, if pressed, walk you to the exact field it came from, and probably tell you what the weather was doing the week it was harvested. Step inside, and the whole enterprise announces itself before you've even ordered. The walls carry the same story the television series has been telling for years. Oxfordshire produce, Oxfordshire names, a menu that reads less like a chalkboard and more like a cast list. Order the beef and you're not simply eating dinner, you're eating the punchline to 4 years of television, served on a plate with chips. Even the old Grand Tour marquee found its way there eventually. Repurposed as a retail space housing a butcher's counter and an outdoor kitchen. because apparently no piece of Clarkson's television history was ever allowed to simply retire gracefully into storage. A tent that once toured continents, that once sat beside racetracks and deserts on the other side of the world, now sits quietly in an Oxfordshire beer garden selling sausages. Everything gets folded back in. Everything keeps earning its place in the wider story, generating revenue long after its original purpose has been served, refusing, rather stubbornly, to be finished. A proper farm ends where the fields end, and that's the natural boundary of the enterprise. Hedgerow, gate, perhaps a stream marking the edge of someone else's land. Diddley Squat recognised no such boundary. It kept finding new rooms to build, new corners of the estate to draw into the same continuous, self-referencing narrative, until the pub itself stopped feeling like an addition and started feeling like the inevitable next chapter. The place where every earlier storyline, every argument, every failed harvest finally sat down together and ordered a pint. So, back to that gate. The hand-painted sign, slightly crooked, that every visitor stops to photograph before they've even switched off the engine. Camera phones raised like they're arriving at a shrine rather than a car park. We asked at the start what you were actually looking at when you looked at it. Not a boundary, in any meaningful sense, not agriculture, certainly not in any sense the word would have meant to a farmer working that same land 100 years earlier. A stage curtain, essentially, hand-painted and slightly crooked. And everything that followed, the shop, the cast, the council playing villain to a script it never agreed to and never quite understood it was performing in, the brewery, the pub, was simply what happened once that curtain went up and steadfastly refused to come back down. The genius of it, if we're honest, was never really about crops or yields or clever accounting tricks buried in the paperwork. It was the recognition, made early and almost entirely instinctively, that a story told with total, unflinching honesty about its own failures is worth considerably more than any harvest ever could be. £144 of profit in year one wasn't a disaster to be quietly hidden from shareholders. It was the punchline the whole enterprise was built on, the foundation stone beneath everything that came after. Diddley Squat never felt like a farm because it was never, at any point, trying to be one. It was trying to be watched. And in 900 acres of Oxfordshire clay, in a queue for chili jam stretching down a country lane, in a council refusal turned quietly into television gold. It succeeded rather more spectacularly than anyone, including the man who bought the place on something close to a whim, could possibly have planned for. There's an old truth about the English countryside that Diddley Squat, in its own chaotic and thoroughly muddy way, ended up proving all over again. That land has always been more than mere acreage. It's a stage, if you're willing to let it be one. A place where failure can be turned, with enough honesty and enough sheer bloody-minded stubbornness, into something people genuinely want to watch, week after week, series after series. That's the real story behind that crooked little sign at the gate. Not a farm at all in the end, whatever the paperwork might claim. A theatre with a tractor parked out front, and an audience that never quite stopped queuing to get inside it. If you enjoyed this one, you know exactly what to do. Subscribe, ring that bell, and tell me in the comments which part of the Diddley Squat story you never quite saw the same way again after today. And if you're hungry for more of this world of British land, legacy, and glorious muddy contradiction, there's another video on your screen right now that I think you'll rather enjoy just as much. Thank you, as ever, for watching.